Welcome, everybody. We'll just wait another minute or so before we get started. Okay, great. Thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to the webinar. My name is Cliona Raleigh. I'm the founder and CEO of ACLED, which is the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Organization. We are a conflict monitor and a leading source of data and analysis on global conflict. I will be moderating today's session, which is called A Perpetual State of War, an analysis of IDF and Palestinian armed group tactics in the West Bank and Gaza. This webinar comes from an excellent piece of research on Israel's Operation Iron Wall in the West Bank, and it has been completed by the ACLED expert for the Middle East, Nasser Khadour, and our Middle East senior analyst, Dr. Amina Mewar, who is here with us today. Amina leads analysis on regional conflicts and provides expertise to ensure the accuracy of ACLED's data coverage of this region. She has expertise in Middle Eastern security and foreign policy, with a focus on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and Persian Gulf security dynamics. Before joining ACLED, Amina worked as a political risk consultant in the private and public sectors and also taught and conducted academic research. We are, as always, delighted to have Amina here. We also have our Middle Eastern Research Manager, Salma Issa, on the session today, and Salma will focus on the situation in Gaza and Israel's operation since the collapse of the ceasefire and the start of Operation Gideon Chariots, which we, of course, have been tracking using ACLED's Gaza Monitor, which we started after October 7th. Salma is responsible for data collection across the Middle East, and she has over 10 years of experience in Egyptian civil society and research in the academia sectors, with expertise in political analysis and trends and patterns of violence in the MENA region. We are also thrilled to have Salma here, of course. And we also have the pleasure of hosting renowned journalist Meron Rapport. Born in Tel Aviv, Meron has been a journalist for the last 20 years at various newspapers across Israel. He is the former head of news at Haaretz and a winner of the Napoli International Prize for Journalism for an inquiry about stealing olive trees from Palestinian owners in 2003. Since 2018, he has been the editor and writer for the Local Call /plus 972 mag, a Israeli-Palestinian independent news outlet, while also contributing to international publications such as The Nation, The Guardian, Middle East Eye, and more. Following Salma and Amine's presentation, Meron will be focusing his comments on the impact of internal Israeli politics on the violence that we are seeing in both the West Bank and Gaza. We will then have time for questions, so feel free to pop your questions into the Q&A function throughout the event. Now, of course, this webinar comes at a really critical time. The humanitarian situation in Gaza has worsened since Israel renewed its offensive this month, and the IDF has laid out plans to control 75% of Gaza within the next 2 months, which will undoubtedly make this situation far worse. And while a lot is known and reported about, of course, in the dire humanitarian situation across Gaza, throughout this war, far little attention has been paid to the implications of Israeli operations and policies in the West Bank. There has been an incremental but persistent policy changes throughout the West Bank that have picked up pace recently and have been reshaping the territory with quite far-reaching consequences for the prospect of Palestinian statehood. We will explore this and more today in today's session with our participants, who will be focusing on the acts more similar to war than policing, and of course the disproportionate actions towards West Bank residents, and the growing equivalence in Israeli policy towards both the West Bank and Gaza. And with that, I will pass it over to Salma to start us off. Thank you very much, Salma.
Thank you, Cliona. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I will be discussing Israel's evolving tactics since the collapse of the ceasefire and how Hamas has responded on both tactical and strategic levels. On 18th March, Israel launched an intensive airstrikes and drone campaign on the Gaza Strip, effectively ending the 42-day ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. The ceasefire that had seen the release of 33 Israeli hostages, airstrikes, and now an expanded ground operation in Israel's military strategy in Gaza, which we will be exploring in the upcoming slides. Next, please. Yes. As we can see here in this graph, in the immediate post-ceasefire period, there is a high surge in air drone strikes across the Gaza Strip, with the level of intensity not recorded by ACLED since the early days of the war in 2023. We are continuing to see this increase going into May, and with the announcement of Israel's newest Operation Gideon's Chariots, we are, of course, seeing this trend continue. The intensification of the Israeli air drone strikes has also been accompanied by a marked increase in their lethality. ACLED has recorded over 3,400 Palestinian fatalities. This number includes both civilians and combatants from airstrikes alone. In parallel, the Israeli military has reported the killing of at least 800 militants since the resumption of fighting in Gaza. Beyond the scale and lethality, what's equally significant is where these strikes have been concentrated. And in this map here, we can see the patterns in air and drone strikes, and they reveal a deliberate focus on specific areas. From this map, we can see that Khan Yunis has seen the highest number of air drone strikes, and it's followed by Gaza City, Deir al-Balah, and then Deir al-Balah, signaling these areas as current strategic priorities for the IDF, of course. But also, particularly with Khan Yunis and the largest concentration of airstrikes there, Khan Yunis has been long considered a Hamas stronghold, and is seen as a central hub for regrouping of Hamas command activity following the destruction of the northern sector earlier in the war. And as such, the intensity of strikes in this area suggests a strategic effort by Israel, not only to degrade Hamas's military capabilities, but also to prevent its reorganization and entrenchment in the south. The spatial concentration of the Israeli and air and drone strikes, particularly in governorates like Khan Yunis, Gaza City, and Deir al-Balah, suggests that the Israeli military is not just responding to these attacks in a reactive manner, but is likely carrying out a broad operational strategy to break up and isolate Hamas's strongholds across Gaza. Moreover, the targeting of these specific areas likely supports Israel's broader ground objectives, particularly the establishment and protection of the military corridors, which we have seen expand throughout the war, but more in much faster fashion recently, with the construction of the most recent security corridor, the Morag corridor in the south. Securing these zones through concentrated aerial bombardment is likely intended to facilitate troop movement and create strategic depth within these buffer zones. But alongside the use of aerial bombardment, Israel also uses demolitions and the raising of land to make way for these security corridors. To better understand the scale and implications of this destruction, let's take a closer look at the implications attached to the construction of the Morag corridor. In addition to the intensified airstrikes, Israel has employed a strategy of demolishing buildings, raising land, actions that ACLED records as property destruction, to clear space for the establishment of these military corridors. And the graph here shows a clear link between the end of the ceasefire and the rising levels of property destruction in southern Gaza. After the Morag corridor was established, we see a marked uptick in demolitions, particularly in Rafah and Khan Yunis. ACLED records 84 property destruction events in the post-ceasefire period to the data cutoff period of 23 May, involving the use of controlled explosives, bulldozers, raising land in Rafah and Khan Yunis to make way for the new corridor, which is a 5 times increase compared to the same prior period. And notably, although these property destruction events have escalated in the post-ceasefire period, the fact that they also have continued to take place during the ceasefire suggests that they are likely part of a broader Israeli operational strategy that goes beyond immediate combat needs. This expanding emphasis on territorial control, given, of course, the announcement of Operation Gideon's Chariots and the emphasis on sustained presence of Israeli forces in Gaza, and now with the newest announcement of Israel possibly taking control of 75% of Gaza within the next 2 months, the establishment of a broad buffer zone has made it increasingly important to track where and these changes are unfolding. One useful tool for visualizing this has been ACLED's Gaza Monitor, which provides up-to-date mapping of buffer zone expansion and key military corridors, all the while tracking the various events unfolding in Gaza. Through this platform, we can clearly observe how the physical landscape of Gaza is being reshaped in real time as part of the broader strategy. This platform compiles real-time and geolocated data on military operations, armed activity, provides spatial representation of developments such as the construction of the security corridors, and is updated weekly with the latest evacuation zones that we see highlighted here in the light purple. As we have seen lately, the UN has said that the evacuation zones have resulted in Israel and Gaza becoming 70% of Gaza becoming either a no-go zone or a security zone. And as we can see here in the map from the Gaza Monitor, we can see that Israel's strategic corridor is the Netzarim corridor that cuts through central Gaza. And then we see the Morag corridor between Rafah and Khan Yunis, and we see the Philadelphia corridor along the Egypt-Gaza border. We see from the map here that these corridors have somewhat fragmented the strip into 3 zones, and these security zones have resulted in restricted civilian movement. They sever north-south connectivity and facilitate more stringent operational control over various sectors of Gaza, which again would play a very important role if Israel is to go through with its announced plan this week of controlling 75% of Gaza within the next 2 months. While these corridors have enabled Israel to assert greater operational control and fragment Gaza into isolated zones, they have also directly shaped the environment in which Hamas operates. And now let's take a closer look at how Hamas is navigating and responding to these evolving conditions on the ground. Hamas's military response in the immediate aftermath of Israel's renewed operations was notably restrained. We only see that the first reaction from Hamas on 20th of March is the launch of 3 rockets towards the southern Israeli coastal city of Ashkelon, which is the only direct action they take during that period. Following this, Hamas remains largely inactive for nearly a month, even as Israel significantly expands its operations across the Strip. Hamas's unresponsiveness during this time is likely in hopes of the reinstatement of the ceasefire. But since then, amid Israel's continued expansion of its operations, Hamas has resumed engagement in mid-April, predominantly, of course, employing guerrilla tactics that we had also seen them transition to in the earlier phases of the war. However, the current level of activity that we are seeing from Hamas is at a much lower rate than that before the ceasefire. In terms of fighting tactics, Hamas is continuing to rely heavily on guerrilla warfare techniques. They are continuing the use of tunnels, which have allowed fighters to conduct surprise attacks and move undetected beneath highly surveilled areas. And as we can see from the map here, Hamas's attacks have remained limited in number, but are geographically dispersed across the Strip, with the highest concentrations of attacks happening in North Gaza and Rafah. Notably, some of the most fatal incidents, as we also can see here, have occurred near or around the newly established buffer zones. And this indicates a likelihood of Hamas exploiting the vulnerabilities that have been created by these expanded areas of control that have permanent Israeli positions. And some of the deadliest attacks that ACLED has recorded have been concentrated in northern Gaza, particularly around Beit Hanun, as well as the southern area of Tal al-Sultan and Rafah, where we see Hamas launching ambushes with IEDs, artillery, targeting positions, Israeli positions in the buffer zone and in the adjacent areas. And from 15th of April to the data cutoff period of 23 May, ACLED reports 5 lethal Hamas attacks against Israeli forces, with killing 7 Israeli soldiers in these attacks. In sum, Hamas's current posture, marked by reduced activity, may reflect both internal constraints and external pressures, including diplomatic calculations and public discontent with the breakout of the first public and vocal protests against the group in late March following the breakdown of the ceasefire. And this delicate balance between military strategy and political survival underscores the complex interplay of the factors shaping the conflict in Gaza. But these tensions are not merely confined to Gaza. Similar dynamics where political pressures, armed responses, and strategic recalculations converge are also playing out in the West Bank. And with that, I'll now hand it over to Amine, who will explore how these developments are unfolding in the West Bank. Thank you, everyone.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today. I'll be focusing on recent developments in the West Bank, particularly how shifts in Israeli policy and military strategy are reshaping the region's geography and governance. As you know, Israel has ruled the West Bank through military occupation since 1967. And on the surface, a status quo held for nearly 2 decades following the Second Intifada, with the Israel-PA security coordination persisting and keeping the region relatively quiet. The interim steps and arrangements outlined in the Oslo Accords remained effectively frozen, with the territory divided in 3 zones. Area A, which is at least nominally under the civil and security control of the Palestinian Authority. Area B, where the PA has civil control, but Israel controls security. And Area C, which is under full Israeli civil and military control. According to the Oslo Accord, Area C was meant to be gradually transferred to Palestinian control, but the transfer has never taken place. The situation on the ground has also never really been static. Israel has steadily expanded its settler footprint through both official approvals and the spread of illegal outposts, aiming to reduce the Palestinian presence in Area C. Annexation has become a normalized position within the Israeli rights, and under the current government, particularly under the shadow of the Gaza war, significant steps have been taken toward annexation. These include the retroactive legalization of outward expansions and a sharp surge in housing unit approvals, many in settlements deep inside the West Bank. Notably, these measures have not been limited to Area C, but have in recent times also expanded into Area B. And while it may take several years for the effects of these plans to fully materialize, they're laying the groundwork for securing spatial dominance over the territory and increasing population growth, developments that could escalate tensions and violence on the ground. And let's not forget that the situation in the West Bank is already deeply concerning. Settler violence has been steadily rising for several years, and dozens of smaller rural Palestinian communities have been driven off their lands. We published a report on this topic in June last year, which I invite you to read. The link is in the chat. Since then, the trend of settler violence has remained steadily high. It is then in this context of prolonged military occupation, the PA's failure to protect Palestinians from violence, and a steadily worsening horizon for a political solution, that organized militancy re-emerged in the West Bank in late 2021 after more than a decade and a half of dormancy. The IDF has understandably responded to the rising militancy, initially through near daily raids, primarily in the northern West Bank, with a heavy reliance on intelligence. But after 7th of October, these responses escalated sharply, adopting increasingly warlike tactics, including the use of airstrikes, something not seen in the West Bank since the Second Intifada. Then in January of this year, the IDF launched its largest military campaign in the Middle East in decades, Operation Iron Wall. This operation has focused heavily on the refugee camps in Jenin and Tulkarm, long-standing hubs of armed resistance, and has had a major impact on civilians. Around 40,000 Palestinians have been displaced, marking the largest forced displacement in the West Bank since 1967. The scale of this displacement, combined with widespread destruction and ongoing demolitions, particularly in Jenin, Tulkarm, and Nur Shams refugee camps, along with the repeated use of airstrikes and other military tactics, has led many to draw comparisons with Gaza. Increasingly, we are hearing references to the Gazification of the West Bank, with these refugee camps described as having been turned into mini Gaza. Israeli officials have also been increasingly framing the West Bank as an active war zone. Militancy in the areas portrayed as part of a broader multi-front war against Israel. Restoring security in the West Bank has been declared an official war objective, and the IDF has designated these refugee camps as military zones. But while the IDF's tactics have resembled warfare to a certain extent, the scale and intensity of violence originating from Jenin and Tulkarm and the West Bank more broadly has not come close to the level of threat posed by armed actors in Gaza and Lebanon, or to the much more significant threat that emanated from the West Bank during the Second Intifada. In a recent report we published, we examined the dynamics of armed groups active in Jenin and Tulkarm since 7th of October to provide a more nuanced and data-driven understanding of the scope and nature of the threat they pose. And a few key points are worth highlighting. These groups, most of which are loosely decentralized small groups that self-identify with Fatah al-Aqsa's martyr brigades, or are affiliated with Palestinian Islamic Jihad, likely receiving financial support from its leadership without clear evidence of direct command and control, operate in a highly localized manner. Nearly 70% of incidents involving these groups in Jenin and Tulkarm have occurred during IDF raids, with clashes taking place in and around the militants' home areas, often aimed at obstructing Israeli operations. As IDF raids intensified, the tactics and weapons used by these groups also became more sophisticated, with a rise in the use of homemade explosives, importantly also roadside bombs, which made IDF operations more dangerous for Israeli soldiers. Beyond the context of IDF raids, we have seen over 300 offensive incidents carried out by groups with many injuries or fatalities. Many involve gunfire from a distance or settlements or checkpoints with little coordination or clear targets, likely intended more as symbolic act of resistance than effective attacks. Finally, attacks inside Israel remain rare. Since 7th of October, only 2 such incidents have been linked to individuals from Jenin or Tulkarm, one involving a Hamas operative and the other an unaffiliated individual. So what does the data suggest? Armed militancy in Jenin and Tulkarm, led by local groups that have grown in sophistication, has posed a security challenge for Israel in recent years, one that the IDF sought to counter through frequent raids and targeted operations. But the limited impact of attacks perpetrated by armed groups outside of raids, coupled with the absence of a major escalation, points to a threat that was largely contained, though not neutralized, prior to the launch of Operation Iron Wall. Yet this operation has employed methods far exceeding counter-militancy measures, suggesting that its motives extend beyond immediate security and operational concerns. The operation was launched shortly after the ceasefire in Gaza took effect, and a show of force in the West Bank, especially the projection of victory in the refugee camps, likely resonated with Israel's far-right and pro-settler factions, to whom Netanyahu has made sweeping concession to preserve his coalition government. These factions have long called for the dismantling of refugee camps, as the camps have refugees and the memory of armed resistance. As Israel continues to systematically demolish buildings and widen roads in the camps to facilitate IDF freedom of movement and action, it appears to be working toward integrating refugee camps with nearby cities and fundamentally reshaping their topography. Additionally, it appears that following the events of 7th of October, Israel's risk tolerance has shifted. Israel is now implementing a strategy of maintaining a military presence on enemy ground to preempt future threats. We have seen this approach not only in Gaza, but also in Lebanon and Syria. And now it seems Israel aims to establish a permanent military presence in some of the refugee camps in the West Bank. Given that these camps are located in Area A under the nominal control of the Palestinian Authority, this move will likely further weaken the PA's authority and deepen its legitimacy crisis, as thousands of Palestinians grow increasingly disillusioned with its ability to safeguard their security. This in turn aligns with the interests of Israel's pro-settler factions who seek to annex the West Bank and extinguish aspirations for the position increasingly reflected in broader Israeli policy. And without a credible political process to offer hope and a path forward, and as creeping annexation and collective punishment deepen Palestine, the long-term security.
Yes, thanks.
Thank you, Salma and Amene. I will not use graphics and just try to have a political analysis of the situation. I would start with Gaza, and I would deal with I would say 3 levels here. One is the Israeli public opinion. The second is the army strategy, and the third is the government and the political aims of the current Israeli government. I will start with the public opinion in Israel. The public opinion in Israel, I would say, since the mid-24, but certainly since the end of 24 and leading to the ceasefire in January, is predominantly and consistently for the end of the war and for a deal to release all the hostages. Just the day before, there was a poll in the Israeli public TV where 53% of Israelis were for a deal, including an end to the war, complete withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, release of thousands of Palestinian prisoners in return to the release of all the prisoners alive and dead. So here we have very consistent Israeli public opinion saying we want, first of all, of course, the hostages, but we want also the war to end. We have seen also in the last weeks, and this is interesting, for the first time, I would say, since the beginning of the war, more public attention in Israel, or more openly speaking about the results of the Israeli what's happening in Gaza, the war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and things like that that were not discussed before, neither by Israeli politicians nor by the media. Then, so this is the framework of the Israeli public opinion. Of course, it has to also with a very the last of Netanyahu losing confidence. Most Israelis also again very consistently about between 60 to 70% think that Netanyahu is continuing the war, that his government is continuing the war for political reasons. Then there is the military. The military was quite happy, so it seems, with the ceasefire. But once it resumed the fighting, and that was a political decision, then it seems that the strategy of the military at the moment is not really going against Hamas as an organization, and even not, and of course, not going for the release of the hostages, because it's quite clear to everyone that the hostages will not be released by a military intervention. The idea of the army is to take over most of the Gaza Strip, 75% of the Gaza Strip, and doing so as militant and Hamas commanders. So what they do is they take over territories. They bombed heavily of these places. They are using, of course, very humanitarian aid as a tool to push people out of, certainly, of Khan Yunis and other areas. And the idea is also to destroy, to lead to total destruction of the areas that they are taking control of. We've seen that in Rafah. Rafah was completely destroyed during this, since the beginning of this operation. This is now completely non-existent. We are seeing the same thing in Khan Yunis. Still not at the scale that we've seen in Rafah. We've seen that the idea for the army, I would say, when these areas are completely destroyed, then they pose, of course, if there's, then there's no threat. And the idea is that the population, the breakdown of the population, the pressure, the huge pressure on the population, starvation, moving them from one place to another, will eventually lead the population to push Hamas to surrender. That's the military. Since we are not seeing adding an official what is being called by Prime Minister Netanyahu implementation of the Trump plan, which means forced expulsion of the Palestinian voluntary expulsion of the Palestinians from Gaza. But this is now an official goal of Netanyahu and Smotrich, the finance minister. There's no big difference. The difference between them at the beginning of the war, it seems that there is some gap between Netanyahu and his more right-wing partners in the government. Now these differences almost disappear. We have seen Netanyahu saying and that there will be not a stone left in Gaza standing, and that the people will have to leave and then emigrate out of the voluntary. We have seen Smotrich just the other day in what's called the Jerusalem Day, saying we want to, the word occupation is a beautiful word. We want to occupy the whole of the Gaza Strip. And to reset. So that's the army for Trump plan. I think the army is also aware of the legal consequences of that. The army is quite aware that the new arrest warrant may be mandated for army officials. Till now, we have arrest warrant for Netanyahu and the defense minister Gallant. I think they are very. I think everyone understands that this is these places uninhabitable, that people will not have a place to return to, and then they will have to concentrate in places where they get food in the southern and Owen Ziv together. I think the soldiers themselves are quite aware that this is the goal of the operation in Gaza. Now, the West Bank is in a very, is almost in large extent is a mirror image of what's going on in Gaza. The same tactics are being implemented in the West Bank. Destruction, we have seen, as Amin told, we have seen destruction in some of the refugee camp in the northern West Bank. Jenin, Tulkarm, in large this really
Recording in
copying
progress.
what is going in Gaza, but still there is a huge difference. The numbers are completely different. 40,000 people that were forced to leave the refugee camp in these 3 months are a number that in Gaza we have seen these numbers in a day or a few hours even, 40,000 people. Of course, the destruction, we're talking about a few hundreds buildings that were destroyed in the
Recording in
free,
progress.
and there's no risk for Israeli civilians in Gaza because there are none. This is not the case in the West Bank. And I think also the justification for an action in the West Bank is much less. Certainly in the Israeli public opinion, there's no October 7, no October 7 came from the West Bank, and certainly internationally the situation is more complicated. So the pattern is the same, but the chances to go really all the way as in Gaza are much slimmer.
Thank you so much, Maren, and of course, Selma. I wanted to pick up on a point that Maren made, if I can first start us off with this, which is that the massive civilian punishment that Amna and Salma discussed is intentional on the part of the Israeli government and, of course, implemented by the IDF forces. And it's intentional as a part of a sequence for two different outcomes. Of course, one is that it will root out Hamas through public pressure from Gazans themselves in a way that the IDF was unable to. And then the second thing I believe you mentioned, Maren, is that it allows for a clearing of Gaza so that the entire landscape has changed. And I suppose one of the bigger questions that has been culminating around the world is that if the Israeli government, which is now besieged in three ways, right, if it's not responding to international pressure, then why is it that the domestic pressure that is clearly being brought to bear about the actions and how the Israeli public is largely against it, not succeeding in dislodging the Netanyahu regime?
It's a big question, of course. There's a lot of frustration, I think, also in the Israeli public. The demonstrations against Netanyahu's government began in the beginning of 23, before the October 7. The numbers are huge in Western countries. Sometimes it reaches 500,000 people in but I would add another thing. I would add that for this government, for Netanyahu and Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, if they see now a golden opportunity once in 100 years to really change the whole narrative, the whole conflict with the Palestinians. If Israel will succeed to drive away 1 million or 2 million Palestinians from Gaza, it will break completely, break the bone of Palestinian national entity. And for them, they understand that stopping the war does not only mean that the government will maybe, there will be new election and they will lose the election. The whole project of how they see the final solution in which the Palestinian national movement will be broken, they see a golden opportunity to achieve it. And if the war is over now, then this golden opportunity that will not return for the next 100 years, I think this is what they think, will be lost. So they will not only lose power, they will lose their dream, their vision, their ideology. So this is why I think they insist so much.
Thank you very much, Maren. It leads to another question that I would like Salma to take on if possible, which is, in this reading of it, the enemy, as according to the Israeli government, of the Israeli people is the Palestinians rather than Hamas. And within that, even if they were to eradicate the Palestinian population within Gaza, they would not have successfully mitigated the threat that Hamas poses to both Israel and, of course, Israeli citizens. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about what is the operational health of Hamas at the moment. They've obviously changed tactics, but are we seeing that they are in fact responding to the environment that Maren has noted and waiting or biding their time rather than, for example, going to be affected by the protests within Gaza, especially about how bad things have become?
Yes, thank you, Queen. That's exactly actually what we're seeing. What Maren is saying, we're seeing Hamas bide their time. They're taking their time to respond, possibly recuperating, but also we feel largely trying to engage in negotiations for the most part to reach a ceasefire. The way Hamas is looking at this now, even with the internal pressure on them, is a need for political survival, which is the only way that they can continue having any sort of role to play in Gaza and even beyond Gaza. And Hamas has shown their strong capacity for adaptation in previous conflicts, given, of course, this is now a very larger scale that this is happening in. But their decentralized structure and their operational structure, which is cell-based, is designed to really absorb some of these leadership shocks that they have gone through. And this structure sort of suggests Hamas may shift from a centralized offensive, which we had seen them already do, to more decentralized now, in terms of the recalibration of their political
Recording in progress.
We discussed the early days of how some of these new groups emerged since late 2021. So this really predates the Gaza war. We discussed this in the report in detail that we published a few months after the start of the war. And I spoke a bit about the context. Them have had, and still some of them have strong political leadership, clear strategy necessarily to that would really lead to change. A lot of their action has been reactive. And many of these groups, now what we discuss now specifically now both in Fulcrum, but across also northern West Bank, PA security forces, but these are very decentralized groups. Then we have the PIJ groups. These PIJ groups, again, many new groups that emerged pre-war, but then really also proliferated after the outbreak of the war, as Israel also, intensified the operations. Some of these the members would, for example, flee to neighboring villages, to neighboring towns, and then new groups would emerge. And often we're talking about we're not talking about battalions, although these groups in their names often have, for example, the name of the town as a battalion, the Jenin battalion. But we're not talking about battalions. These are usually a small number of young men, very in that context of losing hope. They have seen authority, also importantly losing legitimacy, and so they emerge and they have reacted. They emerge and they have reacted, and we have always seen waves of violence in the West Bank. Yeah. So, and it, depending on the context, these violence has been in different forms. So we had, for example, after the second intifada, we had this individual, the knife intifada that was called, in the context, and now in this wave, it has been now again more organized. Is Hamas involved? Yes, there is also Hamas. There are also Hamas operatives. It seems Hamas is, while these groups, for example, PIJ seems to be at least recognizing these new groups as its affiliates. Some of it is, well, when members of these groups are killed, they say, okay, these are our martyrs, what they call martyrs. There is also, it is likely that they provide some financial support, for example, but Hamas has not been supporting the emergence of new groups. Hamas seems to have been having a different areas in Tulkarm and Jenin seem to be more the strongholds of PIJ or groups that self-identify with Fatah. But Hamas has, although after the 7th of October, its involvement has become more, but again, through the cell-based individual operatives that have often, in the significant attacks that we have had against Israeli, Hamas has had a higher involvement through this individual attacks. And these groups have been collaborating together. These groups on the ground, for example, in Jenin, we often see that groups from affiliated with PIJ, with Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigade, does not reflect a wider collaboration if we say that this group of Fatah and PIJ have these now, it is not in that sense a unified front on a broader level. No, these are local groups that are collaborating together. And I must say that I think someone had asked, what is the state? Their state at the moment, we have not seen any armed activity since 2nd of March in refugee camps. The refugee camps are nearly emptied, and we also have to take into consideration hundreds have been killed, hundreds have been arrested. The Palestinian Authority, especially in the past year, has also been arresting, fighting these groups. So at the end, we are talking to start with not a great number of people, and obviously these groups are getting smaller, but there's always new people can join. Yeah. So for now, it seems that this wave has been weakened, but given the conditions that gave rise to this violence, the situation remains very tense.
Thank you, Amina. It certainly seems like a lack of capable and legitimate leadership works for small armed groups and does not work for large populations. We only have a few minutes left, so I'd really love to get your impressions about what we'll be talking about in 6 months, what we'll be talking about in a year for this conflict. So if we were to meet again in October, what do you think we'd be looking at? Mehran, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I think if there's no ceasefire in the next few days, so I would say that we will be in some kind of concentration camps in Gaza. Uh, and it's of Palestinian. I don't know if it depends on Israel. If we will have a ceasefire, and I think now there are more chances that we will have a ceasefire, I think we may see in Israel a new political willingness to see new things, because if ending the war will be a failure, I think this will reflect on the Israeli political internal scene in a positive way, according to where I see it.
Thank you, Meron. So in that case, the Israelis may have been too, everything has been maximized effectively. Interesting. Salma, would you like to go next, please?
Sure. I mean, I tend to agree with Aaron in some of his description of what's coming. We are hearing now that a ceasefire could be very imminent. I do are not likely it's a permanent one, given Israeli leadership's recent political statements and everything that we have seen on the ground also supporting that. I do believe that the fragmentation of Gaza probably will result in some isolated zones with populations being pushed into possibly some of these zones. More than that, I really cannot see where this would probably take us, because I do believe it will rely on a lot of what's happening also internationally. We are seeing a reaction from the European Union and European countries for the first time, some of these are breakthroughs. So I don't know how much of that pressure, along with also what we were seeing from the US being in direct negotiations with Hamas, going to result in. I think these things will play very significant roles, possibly in Gaza also, along with what the Israeli political leadership will be doing, and Hamas's response, of course, and other Palestinian
Thank you so much, Salma. Amina, would you like to close us out then with your take on what might be happening?
Sure. I'm not saying Israeli given up security control of Gaza. Even I think that it is possible that there will be a ceasefire, but I don't think Israel medium long term is planning to seize the city in the West Bank mental annexation. As this is a protracted conflict, and unfortunately, I think for the foreseeable future, we are just going to see continuation and maybe even worsening of the situation.
Well, with those potential predictions, I wish to thank everybody for their time and attention. Panelists and report writers, and of course Meron for coming along to join us. It's been a very sobering view of what's happening within the West Bank and Gaza, but there's some glimmers that there will be a ceasefire soon, according to each of our panelists, and so we can at least hold on to that to stop the suffering that is clearly taking place across the region. Thank you very much, everybody, and please join us again for our future webinars and, of course, future reports, which are all available. Thank you.